Hi, everyone. Hi. So as you heard, Duncan McCall, co-founder and CEO of PlaceIQ. So these guys have been kind enough to have me talk at a number of events over quite a few years. And for those of you who've heard me before, I normally go through new stuff, exciting stuff, looking forward. I often find that one of the most useful things is when people stand up and they talk about stuff that's happened and learnings. And so today I'm going to talk about some research that we commissioned, but also step you through some case studies that hopefully you'll find interesting and informative. So I think one of the first things, and actually, David Card did a presentation earlier about research. One of the first things that's really interesting if you start to think about any company in this space is how important are any of the things we're actually working on to marketers? And it sounds like a basic question, but we actually, we often don't ask ourselves those questions enough. And in a similar way, we commissioned an independent study with a company called 451 Research, and these guys went out and they talked to 200 marketers at big brands, retailers, QSR, automotive, et cetera, and they asked them to reply anonymously to a series of questions. And some of the answers, actually, I thought were pretty interesting. And one of the first questions we asked is, is developing this whole idea of a unified cross-channel customer view important? The ability to understand your customers on mobile, on display in the same way. Only 47% actually said yes. And of course, one of the takeaways from this is the fact that you hear so much hype about how important omni-channel and cross-channel and brand identity and identity graphs are. You actually ask a CMO who's doing 1,000 other things, they're like, you know what, it's not that important. Everybody talks about it, but I got 73 other things to work on. And then if you start to say, have you started to implement an integrated marketing strategy, right? Does your print media jive with your display, with your mobile, with your TV? 36% have started to implement. So initially we're like, wow, this isn't what we expected. And you start to realize there's maybe a gap between what the press tells you and what people talk about versus what people's real actual initiatives on day-to-day actually are. So the next thing that gets a bit more interesting is what about stuff that's more pertinent to everybody in this room as it pertains to location? So one of the key things, and you heard this from David, a much higher percentage, 45% say, hey, this idea of using offline and online connected, so the idea of using offline data to drive online purchase, that's important. And one of the case studies we have online you can go through is we work with Urban Outfitters, and we actually took the offline location signals, and they took those, used them as an audience segment, and compared them against their own first-party purchase data. So the concept of saying the fact that somebody went to certain locations versus the fact that somebody bought something, how important are those two? And Urban Outfitters actually reported there was 147% increase in revenue when they use the location data. So this was a clear learning that offline data to drive online commerce actually really works. The next thing is, 58% talk about this idea of improving marketing measurement. We don't need to go into too much detail here, but this idea that attribution is incredibly important, that's a real phenomenon, right? It's not something that people are just saying. And then finally, if you were to say, okay, well, how does location data fare in this idea of your measurement priorities? This is where it gets really interesting. 81% of these 200 CMOs and VPs of marketing said that location data is the first or second most important element in their marketing stack. And we have a bunch of public case studies on that. So I thought that was kind of an interesting level set. And then if you said, okay, let's really learn how does this stuff actually work when you construct a really, really powerful case study. So some of you may be familiar with this. This is, in my 8-9 years in this industry, this is probably, in my opinion, one of the best case studies I've ever seen. The MMA, Mobile Marketing Association, an independent body, been doing these measurement studies they call SMOCs, which is marketing effectiveness. And they worked with a company called Marketing Evolution. That's a company that does market mix modeling and multi-touch attribution, just specialists in that space, and work with a bunch of vendors and work with PlaceIQ on the location side. And they're essentially saying, we're working with a top 3 QSR, and that QSR wants to understand, hey, I am buying media across a whole bunch of different channels, be it broadcast, mobile, display, et cetera, what is the effectiveness of each one of those channels to drive people into my store? And obviously, as we all know, the idea of driving into store for a QSR is almost as good. In some ways, it's better because you can actually get the data much more easily. It's good or as better as purchase data. So these guys, if you get someone in store into a QSR, that's a great KPI. And then, of course, they're going to say, well, the next thing we wanted to construct in this test is how do different location marketing techniques drive ROI? So this was constructed from the get-go as a real case study and a test. And what you start to see initially is targeted mobile display is 3.5x more efficient at driving store traffic. Just to explain this graph, the overall campaign, this cross-channel campaign, the average performance in terms of ROI is indexed at 100, and then you look at performance for each one of these channels. So radio, slightly better than the average, right? Social, desktop, mobile desktop, quite a bit better. You look at targeted mobile display, 3.5x higher, right? Nothing too compelling there, but an interesting sort of study when you compare it to others. But now where it gets interesting is, okay, let's layer on location. If we layer on location, how does that affect driving consumers into this QSR? And what you see is, first thing, if you use very basic mechanism of geofencing, saying we're only going to target people in the proximity to one of the QSRs, you can double your ROI. Now, where this gets interesting is, well, what about if you start to use more intelligent location-based audiences? And you can start to see geofencing is, 2 and a bit. Now you start to say, let's target people who are just going to QSRs. It's better. But the really interesting thing here, and this is amazing for us to see, is when you build a location-based audience that is intelligent, such as commuters, these are people who are commuting past the store every day. They're not just people who happen to have been in the last month or happen to be 2 months. They're people who are commuting past the store every single day. You now see a 5x improvement in ROI here. Pretty compelling stuff, right? Another interesting thing, over the years, we always used to hear about, we want to use interstitials, we want to use rich media, the creative format's so important. Another thing they configured in this test that I thought was super smart was, let's look at not just targeting and different channels, but what about creative formats? This is something that we've been long believers in, and we've seen in our data. People don't like to hear this, but small display is essentially a mobile banner. Small display outperforms everything. And I've always inherently thought of this idea that we have lots of clients say, we want interstitials, we want rich media. And just from a consumer perspective, right? Imagine the goal here is awareness to drive somebody in to a QSR restaurant, shoving up a massive great interstitial that interrupts whatever they're doing, or having some crazy rich media, I've always inherently thought is a bad experience for a consumer. You just want to tell them, and having a banner ad that doesn't go away, that sits there, that is non-interruptive, I've always thought inherently was a smarter way to do it for this kind of category. And here you see it in the data, right? That small display outperforms interstitial by a huge amount. And again, these are independent figures. These aren't our figures. These are the figures that the MMA and Marketing Evolution came up with. So pretty interesting stuff. And then the next thing you might say is, well, come on, Duncan, QSR and location, those things go together very well. And we know that, right? But if you start to look at, well, retail, you start to say, we're seeing, these are other SMOC studies that have been done. You can start to see that retail gets a 2.5x when you apply location over the norm. But really interestingly here, one of these SMOC studies was working with a very, very large, well-known insurance company. They had all their own KPIs for conversion, and they found that location performed twice as good as the benchmark for other targeting. So obviously, I think you guys appreciate this, but for the last few years, there's gone through a period where people thought of location as purely something that's about the offline world. It's purely for QSR and retail. And of course, now what people are really realizing is location is a behavioral signal that can be applied across a whole series of different verticals and different markets. So another quick case study is some work we've done with a QSR. And the thing I like about this is, it's very easy to come in and say, you know, we had this super cool relationship and we sold these guys this super sophisticated platform. And well, this isn't one of those. This is a story of a QSR that started out very small and started to really learn and optimize using location. And those are the powerful ones, right? So we have a customer and QSR restaurants, like top 5 or top 6, and they are working with us. And PlaceIQ has a partnership and integration to Google's ad server, to DCM, so that all of the ads that this QSR is buying on Google and off Google, using Google's infrastructure like most people, we're able to provide measurement of every single ad they buy. So they can compare ads bought on Google to ads not bought on Google, et cetera, et cetera. And they started realizing what works and what doesn't. And then, of course, the next step is they come back to us and they say, PlaceIQ, we'd like to buy your data so that now we can do audience targeting across all these different properties, across YouTube and Hulu, et cetera. So they're now buying audiences that are key to location, not just doing attribution. And of course, the next stage is, well, now they're optimizing and they're starting to see what works and what doesn't. In Atlanta, people will drive further to go to one of our restaurants than they will in Tampa. We see that in the data. We can buy the audiences from PlaceIQ to optimize against this. And now finally, of course, they've now sold themselves and came to us and said, we now want to potentially look at doing a package with you where we take the entire suite of data, analytics, business insights tools. And this is one of the, you know, our favorite case studies, because it's not like we went and sold someone with a big vision. They started out small and they started learning and optimizing. And that to me is, you know, the world we're moving into, where this stuff is proving ROI from day one. And that's where it gets really interesting. Last thing I think is kind of interesting is to talk about, okay, so what about non-digital? We've heard for years, and we've heard today, the idea of location being deployed in many, many different use cases. So this is a pretty interesting one, whereby we're looking to get this green lit so we can go public with a brand here. But this is, let's say, a beverage producer, and they were looking to understand, hey, we spent a lot of money to sponsor very large sporting events. And we have no freaking idea how we quantify the investment, huge investment we're making at those stadiums to selling more product. We know it's good for our brand, but what's really the ROI there? So one of the things we did is we connected event sponsorships using location to purchase data. So of course, very easy to understand all of the people who visited a sports stadium. You don't have to argue about that. It's a very large, clean spatial structure. We can now see all of those devices. We can see how far they came. We can see their other behaviors, et cetera. And of course, we can correlate that through a partnership we've had for some years with IRI, correlate that on almost a one-to-one basis through LiveRamp to be able to connect this data to physical purchases in stores down to category and SKU level. So now, of course, we run this analysis and say, this group of people, we see a whole group of people who go to sports games. Let's look at the people who actually went to the sports games with a sponsorship versus a true control who didn't. And we can see, did they actually buy more of this beverage product? And this is a case study that's actually, we've run a couple of webinars on it. Some people may be familiar, but we're going to be doing a press release on. Super compelling. They actually were able to see that their investment in sponsorship resulted in approximately a 2x purchase uplift from that group of consumers that were exposed at those sporting events to their particular product. And I've been on a lot of the calls with this client, and they are legitimately super excited about this. So obviously the learning here is, right, what provides, we have sports attendance, we have purchase data. Location provides the connection between the two in a privacy-friendly but census-based mechanism to be able to allow these huge brands to understand ROI. So look, if I was to try and summarize some of that stuff, right, into a few takeaways, I've always thought that it's great to keep up with the press and what everybody's talking about and what the hot things are. But when, at the end of the day, if you go and talk to a CMO or a VP of marketing who is in the trenches, they may have a very different set of priorities in terms of what they're looking to get done. So don't always believe the hype. I think the other thing is if you look at that SMOX report, and I'm pretty sure you can find it online, it's an amazing case study. You look at that and you can start to see that location is an enabler and it's a multiplier. But if you start thinking about a location as a behavior that can be used to segment intelligent audiences, you can now start to think about 5x ROI and return, and that gets really interesting. Another thing that, again, we've always believed, and this was probably the first independent data, is basic formats are often the best when you're focused on driving ROI. Don't overcomplicate things. Don't get sold into sexy, rich media and interstitials. Keep it basic, and you can drive ROI. And then obviously, think of the idea of purchase data. Many of you are familiar with the concept of connecting location with purchase. So it doesn't feel like a new thing, but I feel like we're just getting to the cusp of this whole idea of now fusing all of these different data sets, behaviors to location to purchase, and we're really on the edge of unlocking a whole new set of and location being the way to do it. So with that, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to hang out afterwards for any questions, but I appreciate everyone's time and attention. Thank you.